Hello, and welcome to English for Philosophy students. We are in our 29th lesson in Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules for Life. And we are starting lesson number 16 of rule number 4. Last week, we talked about how a person who is small-minded and narrow and focused on selfish gain lives in a world of bitterness and pettiness and strife. And a person like that finds it impossible to believe in a good God, a New Testament God. A person who is focused on getting for themselves something small and petty. They believe that it is logically impossible that there could be a good God who is all-powerful. But when that same person takes a step back and broadens their perspective and begins to let in some light, they begin to consider that there may be other kinds of good than the petty, small good they have been pursuing. Then that person begins to be able to believe in a better God. And he also begins to live in a better world. He can see the good more clearly. So that was the basic idea that we ended with last week. We ended with, you decide to let in a little light. You decide to aim for a better life instead of a better office. Because the example was a man who wants his boss's job and his boss's office. So you're going to now pursue a better life instead of a better job. Let us continue. First of all, I want to see if I can get this one. But you don't stop there. You realize that it's a mistake to aim for a better life if it comes at the cost of worsening someone else's. So you get creative. You decide to play a more difficult game. You decide that you want a better life in a manner that will also make the life of your family better, or the life of your family and your friends, or the life of your family, your friends, and the strangers who surround them. What about your enemies? Do you want to include them too? You bloody well don't know how to manage that, but you've read some history. You know how enmity compounds. You know how enmity compounds. So you start to wish even your enemies well, at least in principle, although you are by no means yet a master of such sentiments. Let's go back. I'm looking for where we are. Oh, here we go. But you don't stop there. Stop where? stop with aiming for a better life. Our transition is you are going to aim for a better life, but you don't stop there, meaning this is not all you're going to do. You're going to do even more. That's what you don't stop there means. It's a phrase we use often to mean I'm going to do even more than the thing that was said. So you don't stop there. You realize that it is a mistake to aim for a better life if it comes at the cost of worsening someone else's. So, someone else's life. So, you realize that it would be wrong to make your life better if it also at the same time made someone else's life worse. You don't want to improve you and take away from someone else. It would be better to go up together. Sometimes when my children were young, I spoke to my children about increasing the joy of the universe. I say, by doing this good thing, you are increasing the joy of the universe. You don't want to simply take some joy from someone else. You want to increase the joy in the universe. So, you don't want to aim to pursue a better life for yourself if that better life comes at the cost of worsening someone else's life. So, as a result, you get creative. That means you must now use your imagination to try to find a solution to your problem. That's what get creative means. It means to find a solution that is not obvious, that is not easy. So you get creative. You decide to play a more difficult game. So this is obviously an analogy to a game. We often say, "What's your game?" Meaning, what are you doing? Well, you are going to play a different, more difficult game. In other words, you are going to attempt something more difficult. You decide that you want a better life in a manner that will also make the life of your family better. So this is how you are going to pursue a better life. Your better life will also improve the life of your family, or the life of your family and your friends. So you see, this is not a complete sentence. The idea is you take the beginning of this sentence, you decide that you want a better life in a manner that will also make, and then you begin with the life of your family better. Then you say, no. Make the life of your family and your friends better. No. Make the life of your family, your friends, and the strangers who surround them better. No, not enough. What about your enemies? Can they be included? Do you want to include them too? You bloody well don't know how to manage that. This bloody well is not really American. It's more British and apparently Canadian. And it is a word that makes things more extreme. So basically, you don't know how to manage that. You bloody well don't know how means you really, really don't know how to manage that. Meaning, manage that means do that. And that means love your enemies. You decide, you don't know how to get a better life in a manner that will also make your family, your friends, the strangers that surround them, and your enemies' lives better. You don't know how to manage that. Manage that means to accomplish a difficult task. We say to a person, can you manage this much? Meaning, I am giving you a lot of work. Can you do that much, or must we make it less? So that suggests a large amount of difficulty. So you can't manage it, or you don't know how to. But you've read some history. You know how enmity, which is hatred, like what you feel to an enemy, compounds. So, for example, in American history, we have the story of the feuds between families. There were two, I forget their names, the McCoys and the Hatfields. It was a group of people with the last name of McCoy and a group of people with the last name of Hatfield, and they had a feud, almost like a war that lasted for generations in the mountain country in the United States. Many, many people died, and nobody ever remembered what started the enmity. So we see how it grows. You must diffuse it. So you start to wish even your enemies well. The phrase is wish well. I could say, I wish you well. I wish President Trump well. You put the object in the middle. Wish someone well. So you start to wish even your enemies. And you know the word even is extreme. Even your enemies well. To wish them well means to hope for good fortune for them. At least in principle, which sort of takes a step back. You wish them well, but not very concretely. It's not like now they are your son or daughter that you will support. But in principle, you're not going to kill them or set fire to their house. So you wish them well, at least in principle, if not more. Although you are by no means yet a master of such sentiments. So, you begin to wish your enemies well, although you are not a master yet of this feeling. By no means not, but it's a very strong not. If you say to me, do you favor the law permitting abortion? I would say, by no means. I favor abortion being outlawed. So, by no means is a very strong no. Yet refers to time. This suggests that you are growing. So you will someday be the master of such sentiments. Someday you will be very good at loving your enemies. Right now you are not, but you are moving in that direction. So you're definitely not, you're by no means a master yet. But this sentence implies that you are moving and growing in that direction. Let's move on. And the direction of your sight changes. You see past the limitations that hemmed you in unknowingly. New possibilities for your life emerge, and you work toward their realization. Your life indeed improves. And then you start to think further, better. Perhaps that means better for me and my family and my friends, even for my enemies. But that's not all. That's not all it means. It means better today in a manner that makes everything better tomorrow, and next week, and next year, and a decade from now, and 100 years from now, and 1,000 years from now, and forever. Wow. That is another big paradigm expansion. So, in the progression of thought, last week, people were closed down and thinking a good God is a logical impossibility in a terrible world. Then they let in a bit of light and began to consider repenting of their envy and receiving a different kind of goal, a different pursuit. As a result, they began to see new possibilities and develop the goal of a better life rather than just a better job. But then, as they were letting in a little light, even more began to come in, and they thought, not just a better life for me, but also one that includes other people, my loved ones, and even my enemies. So this is a larger perspective. And now it is becoming even larger. And the direction of your sight changes. Remember, the sight is what we are focusing on, what we are conscious of. Everything else we are more or less blind to. So again, the direction of our sight changes. You see past the limitations that hemmed you in unknowingly. So previously, I was hemmed in by my desire for my boss's job. Then I was hemmed in by my personal desire for a better life. Then I was hemmed in by simply thinking a better life for me and the people around me. And now, new possibilities for your life emerge. And you work toward their realization. Realization does not mean to realize something, to think about it, to understand something for the first time. Realize does mean that, but it has another meaning too. It means accomplishment, actualization. You work toward the achievement of your new possibilities. That is what this realization means. Your life indeed improves. So why do we need the word indeed? Well, previously we were talking about aiming for improvement, and now he is saying the improvement is an actual fact. It is established. Your life is improving. Not just we are aiming, but it is happening. So indeed, it has happened and is happening. And then you start to think further. So you have been thinking of greater and greater possibilities, and now you continue and think even further. And here is a quote. It goes all the way. This is your new thought. Better? What does better mean? Perhaps that means better for me and my family and my friends and even my enemies. We already thought that. But that's not all that it means. In addition, it means better today in a manner that makes everything better tomorrow and next week and next year and a decade, 10 years from now and 100 years from now and 1,000 years from now and forever. I will just tell you, a decade is 10 years, 100 years is a century, and 1,000 years is a millennium, and forever. So now we are not only trying to make life better now for people around us, friends and enemies, we are actually trying to make it better through time as well. I think about William Wilberforce. He lived in the 1800s in England, and he worked his whole life in their parliament to get slavery abolished in the British Empire. And as a result, life on earth has been better for a century and a half so far. So he really did this. Moving on. And then better, hold on. And then better means to aim at the improvement of being. Notice these capitals. With a capital I and a capital B. I cannot get the hang of this double click thing. Here we go. Okay. Thinking all of this, realizing all of this, you take a risk. You decide that you will start treating Old Testament God with all his terrible and oft arbitrary seeming power as if he could also be New Testament God, even though you understand the many ways in which that is absurd. In other words, you decide to act as if existence might be justified by its goodness, if only you behaved properly. And it is that, it is that decision, that declaration of existential faith that allows you to overcome nihilism and resentment and arrogance. It is that declaration of faith that keeps hatred of being, with all its attendant evils, at bay. And as for such faith, it is not at all the will to believe things that you know perfectly well to be false. Faith is not the childish belief in magic. That is ignorance, or even willful blindness. It is instead the realization that the tragic irrationalities of life must be counterbalanced by an equally irrational commitment to the essential goodness of being. It is simultaneously the will to dare set your sights at the unachievable and to sacrifice everything, including, and most importantly, your life. You realize that you have literally nothing better to do. But how can you do all this, assuming you are foolish enough to try? So let's go back. And then better means to aim at the improvement of being. So we saw in the previous paragraph that we are aiming to make life better for ourselves and the people around us, including our enemies, not just for now, but forever. And this is considered the improvement of being. Okay, so there's our transition. This whole concept we've talked about up here is now referred to as the improvement of being. Our goal is not just to have a better life myself, but to improve existence for everyone. Thinking of all this, realizing all this, so thinking of all this, realizing all this. Thinking of all this is a little bit different than realizing it. Thinking it is just, well, I wonder if this is true. Realizing it is, wow, this is true. When you realize something, you realize you come to know that it is true. It is not just something you're thinking about, which may be true or false. Thinking all of this, realizing all of this, you take a risk. You go into some danger. You do something which puts you in some danger. That is what take a risk means. And here's the risk. You decide that you will start treating Old Testament God as if he could also be New Testament God. I skipped this portion that's in between. When you are reading, you must keep a hold of the thread of the main sentence, then add in the extra information. So the main sentence is, all right, you take a risk. What is that risk? The risk is to decide that you will start treating Old Testament God as if he could also be New Testament God. In other words, you already believed in Old Testament God because Old Testament God throws calamity at people and at whole groups, and we see horrible calamities. Therefore, a vengeful, terrible God is easy to believe in if you are living in a world of bitterness and evil. But to expand your horizons and to begin to see that New Testament God may actually be Old Testament God, that actually changes the nature of the world completely. It gives room for the essential goodness of the world. And he is saying this is a risk. Okay, let's add in the rest of the sentence. Okay, so thinking of all this, realizing all this, you take a risk. You decide that you will start treating Old Testament God, and now with all his terrible and oft arbitrary seeming power. So this clause is describing what we believe about Old Testament God. We believe he is terrible and he has terrible power. And that power often seems arbitrary. He powerfully destroys people for no good reason. That is what arbitrary means. This oft arbitrary seeming juxtaposition of words, you can do that in English. There is no such word as oft arbitrary seeming. Jordan has put them together to say that often God's power seems arbitrary. So, Old Testament God, with all his terrible power and often seeming arbitrary power, you're treating that guy, God, as if he could also be New Testament God. Now we have another one. Even though you understand the many ways in which that, meaning Old Testament God and New Testament God, are the same person, that is absurd. So you are aware of the arguments that suggest that they are logically unreconcilable, but you begin to treat, meaning act as though, and act toward Old Testament God as if he were the same person as New Testament God, whether it has absurd aspects or not. In other words, so a restatement now, you decide to act as if existence might be justified by its goodness. Remember, I said if New Testament God is real, then the cosmos is good, is orderly, is ruled by a good power. If only you behaved properly. Now this is part of Old Testament God especially. Old Testament God required you to behave properly. And if you carelessly wandered down the wrong path, he would throw a lightning bolt at you and destroy you completely. New Testament God also has some of these characteristics. There is a story of a couple named Ananias and Sapphira in the book of Acts, who God basically struck dead because they committed what seems to many people a small sin. So, when you believe that Old Testament God and New Testament God are the same person, then some of this Old Testament fear and reverence comes into New Testament. And we cannot treat God as buddy-buddy. He's just a nice guy who we can push around. So Old Testament God becomes more loving and more reasonable, and New Testament God becomes more formidable when we unite the two. And it is that what? It is that decision. Okay, so the decision to treat Old and New Testament gods as one, with fear and reverence and trust and love. That decision, that declaration of existential faith that allows you to overcome nihilism, resentment, and arrogance. So, the decision to believe in a God that combines Old Testament characteristics and New is a declaration of existential faith, of a nature to allow you to overcome nihilism, which is, of course, belief in nothing and chaos. Also overcome resentment, angry that people have hurt me, unable to forgive, and arrogance. I am the greatest wise person. It is that declaration of faith. Old Testament and New Testament gods are the same. That keeps hatred of being at bay. Let's keep the thread of the main sentence. The declaration of faith keeps hatred of being at bay. That means at bay means keeping it off, keeping it away. Generally, something bad, something dangerous is coming after you. If you keep it at bay, you hold it off. It is still trying to hurt you, but it can't get to you because you are keeping it at bay. That's what that means. So, this declaration of faith keeps hatred of being away from you so that it can't hurt you. Let's put back in this. Hatred of being, that means where you hate being. You think the world sucks. That's hatred of being. With all its attendant evils. So, hatred of being is bad for us in many, many ways and destroys our lives. So we want to keep it at bay. So this little phrase here is describing hatred of being. And as for such faith is this one. It's the one that we are talking about, that Old Testament and New Testament God are one consistent whole. That faith. As for this faith, it is not at all the will to believe things you know perfectly well to be false. There is a joke that we tell in English. We say, faith is believing in things you know aren't true. Faith is believing in things you know are not true. Aren't true. I'll say it one more time because sometimes people can't hear that aren't in rapid speech. So listen to how it sounds. Faith is believing things you know aren't true. He is saying this faith is not at all the will, the intention to believe things you know aren't true. Things you know perfectly well to be false. Okay, so that's not faith. Faith is not the childish belief in magic. So faith is not blind optimism, naive optimism, cockeyed optimism. That's a phrase in English. It means optimistic for no reason other than my own disposition is to be happy, but it is unrealistic. It is not that. Faith is not that. That is ignorance, or even willful blindness. Willful blindness would be culpable. Culpable means blameworthy and worthy of punishment, not morally legitimate. So, believing things you know to be false is self-deception. And this is not what faith is. It is instead. So instead of trying to force yourself to believe something clearly false, instead of that, it is the realization that the tragic irrationalities of life must be counterbalanced by an equally irrational commitment to the essential goodness of being. Complex. Okay, it is instead the realization. In this use of realization, we mean coming to believe something to be true for the first time, recognizing truth. We do not mean making something actual as before. So this is the other use of realization. It means something mental right now. So faith is the mental realization where we see the truth of the fact that the tragic irrationalities of life. So tragic means very sad. Irrationalities means things that don't make sense. So, for example, a young mother dying in childbirth, or a rising star with great talent being killed in an automobile accident, or a great leader being assassinated. These things that are just stupid and tragic and don't make sense, or a tsunami destroying a whole island full of people. These things must be counterbalanced by an equally irrational commitment to the essential goodness of being. So you see the irrational tragedy of life, but you are equally committed to the essential goodness. And those two counterbalance each other. No one can deny that irrational tragedies occur, but one must, if one is to believe in New Testament God, then one must be committed to believe that life is essentially good. You must believe in the essential goodness of being. It is simultaneously the will to dare set your sights at the unachievable and to sacrifice everything, including your life. So it, again, is our faith. Our faith is simultaneously, so at the same time, two things. The will to do the impossible thing and the will to sacrifice your own life. You realize, meaning you know, you have literally nothing better to do. He uses literally because I have nothing better to do is a figurative phrase. It's a figure of speech. Do you have nothing better to do? Well, go sweep the floor then. So he means literally there is no better thing you can do. but he is making a little bit of a play on words by saying you have literally nothing better to do. But how can you do all this? Assuming you are foolish enough to try. Okay, so we're going to stop here, but I want to tell you, I was thinking while we were talking about simultaneously set your sights at the unachievable while sacrificing everything. There is a play, a stage theatrical play called Man of La Mancha. It is the story of Don Quixote, and it's a musical, very beautiful. And Don Quixote is a man who is kind of crazy. He is delusional, and his delusion is that he is a knight, like the knights of the Round Table of King Arthur. He is a knight, and his quest is to dream the impossible dream. There's a song called To Dream the Impossible Dream, and I'm going to try to recite the words for you now. See if I can remember them. Maybe I'll sing it. We'll see. I'll try it. It goes like this. To dream the impossible dream. To fight the unbeatable foe. To try when your arms are too weary. To reach the unreachable star. This is my quest, to follow that star, no matter how hopeless, no matter how far, to fight for the right without question or pause, to be willing to march into hell for a heavenly cause. And I know that I'll always be true to that glorious quest, when my heart will lie peaceful and calm, when I'm laid to my rest, and the world will be better for this. That one man, scorned and covered with something, still strove with his last ounce of courage to reach the unreachable star. There's actually more to it than that. I skipped a verse. But you could find it on YouTube. It's called To Dream the Impossible Dream from Man of La Mancha. And the guy is crazy. And he tilt, I'll write that down for you. It's a strange word. Tilt, T-I-L-T. He tilts at windmills. Tilt, the normal meaning of the word tilt is to go like this. Sideways. I am tilting sideways. But in this context of Don Quixote, tilt means to fight. Two knights ride on horses at each other with their lances, and they hit each other and knock each other off their horses. This is called tilting. And Don Quixote tilts at a windmill, which is inanimate. And he thinks it's a giant, and he is attacking it. And he gets knocked off his horse when the fans of the windmill come around. And he believes he has been defeated by the giant. and he meets a woman who is a prostitute, and he sees her as a noble and pure lady, and gives her the name Dulcinea, which means soft one. And eventually, Don Quixote's family chase him down and lock him up in an insane asylum where he withers and begins to die. But the girl, whom he calls Dulcinea, her real name is Aldonza, she is so brokenhearted at the loss of him that she goes and finds him on his deathbed. And they reprise this song I just recited for you. And then she goes out to the world to continue his quest. He has literally transformed this prostitute into Dulcinea, simply by the power of his vision, even though he was mad. So you may want to look this up if you can see the movie. But it really reminds me of all this. So I will see you next week, and I think I'll go watch Man of La Mancha so that I can hear that song again. See you later.